API guy Uganda, and you're welcome to this tutorial where we look at MTN MoMo OpenAPI callbacks. Over time, I've realized from the different developer communities that the developers are struggling with making callbacks work in their applications. For most of the cases, developers are able to successfully integrate into the Momo API. However, they face a lot of issues on making callbacks work. So in this tutorial, I want to take the developers in a step-by-step guide on how to ensure that callbacks are working with MTN Momo API. The scope of the tutorial will be, we'll just have a brief at what callbacks are, why we use callbacks, then we'll have a setup of the OpenAPI account to enable you to receive callbacks. We'll do an end-to-end demo that shows how to make a callback work. We'll have this for sandbox and then for production. And lastly, we'll look at a few troubleshooting skills, troubleshoot callbacks in production. So what are callbacks? In brief, a callback is just a request from the API server to the client application for a request that has been previously sent by the client application. So for this case, you have an application that is consuming the Momo API, and say, for example, you post a transaction to the Momo API, and in return, the Momo API will respond to you with the final status of that transaction. So that leg from the Momo API to your application is what we call a callback. So why do we use callbacks? Because for most applications, most of transaction applications, they always give you an endpoint, which they usually call the Get Transaction Status API, that enables you to fetch for the status of a given transaction that you recently posted. So why bother with callbacks? And there are basically two reasons as to why we bother with callbacks. First of all, callbacks give you a real-time response depending on what the API application is doing. For example, when you post the transaction, as soon as the transaction gets completed on the server side, the callback will send you a real-time notification in that instant. For most cases, when you're doing get transaction status, you'll have something like, say, a cron job that periodically checks for the status of transactions. Well, this is fine and it can work, but of course, as you know, for the cron job, you'll have to schedule it for, say, I want it to run after every 1 minute. So meaning at the bare minimum, there is a worst case scenario that a person will have to wait for 1 minute after successfully completing the transaction on their end before you can complete it on your side. So this is where callbacks are advantageous, in that the moment the transaction is completed, you're notified and you're able to do whatever action you're supposed to take on your side. You don't have to wait for the cron jobs, and that's the beauty of callbacks. The other non-trivial benefit is, of course, it saves you server resources. You don't have to periodically keep on querying the server to get to know the status of your transaction. So we'll jump straight into how to set up your OpenAPI account to receive the callbacks. So for this, I'll just first give a brief in this slide, and then when we reach to the demo, we'll see how to do it end to end. So for Sandbox, you do this setup on creating the API user. This is under the user provisioning APIs. So on Sandbox, for you to be able to get the API user and API key, which work as your username and password on the Momo API, you need to create them using an API call. And in the API call, for configuring for creating the API user, this is where you set the provider callback host for your callback URL. Let's say you have an endpoint. I'll just mess up my slide a bit. So let's say you have a callback URL. I'll just increase the font of this such that it's visible. So let's say my callback URL is http://test.com/receive MTN callbacks. So when I'm sending my request for creating an API user, I'm supposed to pass a body, and in that body, I specify the provider callback host field, and this is just the domain bit of your callback URL. So for this case, it's not your full callback URL as in this, but just the domain bit or subdomain bit of your callback URL. So for this case, it would be test.com. So this can be example 1 and example 2. Let's say my callback URL is test.com api.test.com, which is just a subdomain. So for this case, my provider callback host would be api.test.com. So it's basically the domain or subdomain on which your callback URL is running. Oh, I hope that's clear to all of us. Then the other important step is when you're sending your request, you're supposed to pass the X callback URL header. And in this, you pass the actual value of your callback URL. So when I'm posting my transaction, let's say I'm sending my request to pay, in the headers, I'll have to pass the header X callback URL with a value, my actual callback URL. That's the second point. And another point to note is due to certificate issues, most developers always find it hard to find working webhooks that they can use to test out these callbacks. So I've shared here 2 webhook sites that you can use. One of them is webhook.site and hookdeck.com. I'll leave the links to these in the description of the video, and you can use this to create test callback URLs that you can pass, and then you simulate how the callbacks work on the sandbox. For production, this creation of this setup of the provider callback host is done from the MTN developer portal, from the MTN partner portal, which is I'll put the link to this in the description, but I believe it's https mobile money mtn.co.ug/read-only/partner. I'm not sure of this. I'll just put it in the description. I'll put the correct link in the description, not to misguide you. And I'll still attach a guide that is shared by the MTN team that helps you do a setup of the provider callback host in production. But basically, in this form, you'll have two fields on that form that are important. One of them is the provider callback host. So this is still the same. It's just the domain bit or subdomain bit of your callback URL. And then the other field is the payment server URL. For this, you put the actual server URL, the actual callback URL for your callback. The other point remains the same. You need to pass the X callback URL header in your request. That can be your request to pay, your transfer, or deposit, or withdraw. And another important point to note in production, there is a list of supported intermediate certificates. Production basically uses HTTPS, and for MTN to be able to access your callback URL, you must be using one of the listed intermediate CAs. So your callback URL must have a certificate that is provided by one of the listed intermediate certificate authorities. The certificate authorities are listed on the MTN developer portal. I'll also leave a link to this in the description of the videos for your checkup. So lastly, we'll go to the section of the demos in which we'll have a demo for production, a demo for sandbox, and then just a few troubleshooting tips to troubleshoot callback failures. So I'll return shortly to take us through the demo. Yeah, thank you.